That is absolutely because the Conservatives won the majority, a large majority of the seats last time. So obviously they're on the defensive. And obviously if Labour are 20 points behind in the polls, they'll be hoping to win seats that are far behind the front line of Conservative seats. So then the Conservatives go and defend those seats. So in that sense, yes, it's defensive.
William, is this a Hail Mary manifesto? Is this a manifesto that's got to do something that hitherto has proved impossible?
Well, all Conservatives will hope, of course, that it improves the prospects of the party, which of course it's still far behind in the opinion polls in the election. But it has to be realistic as well, and I think from the sound of it, from what we're hearing so far today, the merit of this manifesto will be that it's in line with what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have been doing for the last 2 years. And in this world where it's so hard for people to believe what politicians say, the one thing on the whole you can believe is that they will carry on doing what they have just been doing. And so they have been cutting national insurance contributions while at the same time raising health spending and so on. And that seems to be at the heart of the manifesto that they're going to publish today. So it isn't, when you say Hail Mary, it's not like everybody said, oh, now that has been revealed. Now everybody can go back to voting Conservative, because there's no such moment in an election. But it sounds like it is a credible program in line with what Rishi Sunak has been doing for the last 2 years.
Kezi, does it matter that it's very easy to disbelieve all the parties in this area? We've had the Tories and Labour on today. They're all promising various things. They're all saying their costing is absolutely rigorous. But ultimately, we know once people start talking about things like cracking down on tax avoidance or making the public sector more efficient, that's code words for we don't really have the money and we hope we'll be able to find a way of doing it in the future. And everyone seems to do this. And I just wonder whether people start shrugging their shoulders and go, you talk about fully costing and I don't believe you.
I completely agree with that. And I think something that we know very well from the evidence is that the public don't really differentiate between political parties when it comes to how they feel about days like this. Levels of trust in politics and the political system itself is at a real low, and particularly low amongst women, people on low incomes and young people. So it's a plague in all their houses in that sense. That leads me to say that William's right, actually. The best the Conservative Party can hope for today is that people see a bit of consistency around their plans, and that cut in national insurance sits very well in that context.
On that point, William, sort of the best and what the Tories can hope for, there's a story in the Times today about how defensive this campaign is. They've basically given up in various areas. They're giving up a bit to the Lib Dems. They're giving up a lot to Labour in places like the Red Wall. They just can't lose their core. Will people be sitting with Rishi Sunak and saying, actually, the aim here is to try and get to 150 seats so we don't get completely ruined as a party? It's a defensive, don't lose too badly strategy. Do you think that'll be being stated in public? Not in public, in private, rather. I'm sure it's not being stated in public.
No, I don't think so. I think, again, as a party that's been in office a long time and is this far behind in opinion polls, obviously expectations get quite low about the election result, both in the media and in that party itself. But the battleground in this election is still a very wide battleground. In terms of the numbers of seats that could go one way or another, it's actually a rather unusually wide battleground. There's still a very wide range of possible outcomes to the...
But that's because so many Tory safe seats have stopped being safe, William. I mean, that's not a virtue. That's because stuff that was going to be 15,000 majorities are now looking wobbly.
That is absolutely because the Conservatives won the majority, a large majority of the seats last time. So obviously they're on the defensive. And obviously if Labour are 20 points behind in the polls, they'll be hoping to win seats that are far behind the front line of Conservative seats. So then the Conservatives go and defend those seats. So in that sense, yes, it's defensive, but I don't think you find any, even Conservative candidates who've only got small majorities have given up on the election, because they also know that we're in an age where the results vary more from one constituency to another than they ever used to 20 or 30 years ago. You can get a really big difference in the swing, even in neighbouring seats, according to whether that MP is popular, with the local campaigning, local issues. These things have become more important. So, yeah, of course it's defensive in a party that won most of the seats last time and is under a lot of pressure now. But it's still a very wide battleground, is what I would say.
I don't know how honest you're going to want to be with this question, William, but what's it like when you wake up in the morning and you're leading a party and you just know you're not going to win the election? How do you cope with that? Because it must mean anyone who does a job, when they get up and think this job is not going anywhere, this job is futile. People experience that in all sorts of walks of life, but it's a very public way of experiencing it in politics. And this must have happened to you, where you just, I'm not going to win. I'm not winning. And yet you've still got to get up every morning. You've still got to plaster the false smile on your face. How do you cope with doing that?
Well, the first part of coping with that is not to actually think that thought that you were just describing, even if it may be quite a rational thought. It's very important to say, well, actually, particularly at this stage of an election, nobody's actually voted yet. Nobody's even voted by post yet. So if you are a party leader, and yes, you're way behind and so on, and of course you could be forgiven in that, and certainly I had moments 2001 when I felt very discouraged. You do have to remember, you're trying to give people the right in a democracy to have a vote here. So it's your duty to get out of bed and, do your absolute best and not behave as if they've all voted already. So the first thing is to have a sense of duty about that. And then the second thing is just almost to enjoy it, okay, it's a battle where the odds are against you, but there can be a certain sense of liberation about that, of charging into it. And, that is, here you got President Macron, there he is calling a general election in France as well, a parliamentary election. All the odds are against him, but he's decided to just fling everything at it. And so there is that, the politicians can get that sense of liberation in an election. So it's not quite as bad as your question might suggest.
William is writing in the Times today that the Farage insurgency will allow Labour to stay in power for many years. He compares this to 1983. William, I think this is an argument that many people are making. Farage doesn't really care about it. His answer to this is, I want to destroy the Conservative Party. And if you vote for me and Labour get in, well, Labour are going to get in anyway. And I want to stick it right up the Tories and therefore I don't care. But you think there is an argument to be made here for people who are right-leaning that they might end up with a more left-leaning government?
Well, yeah, I'm saying if you spend all your time trying to realign the right, you end up with the country being realigned to the left, really. And so it's the mirror image of 1983, where the SDP and the Labour Party were fighting it out in that election with almost even votes. And the Conservatives, with 42% of the vote, won a record majority. But importantly, didn't just win that election, and it's not just about this election now. That actually set the Conservatives up for another decade in power, for everything Margaret Thatcher wanted to do to become really entrenched. It really changed the country towards the right. And so I'm pointing out to people who might vote Reform that that's what's at stake in this election. But I'm also saying that just like the SDP could never really take over the left because there were such strong roots of the Labour Party, this Reform movement won't actually fully take over the right, whatever happens in Britain, because there's a large part of the right, like me, who are internationalist and environmentalist and more moderate in our conservatism. And we're just not going to go along with that. The right would split forever. So, it isn't going to work. That's why Nigel Farage is more like Shirley Williams than he is like Donald Trump in the end. He might not like that idea, but that's who I'm comparing him to in my column today.
Do you think that actually that kind of won the 92 election is really what you're saying? And that that level of a majority, that level of a split, actually they were going to win it in 83 anyway. Maybe they would have won it in 87 anyway, but it probably gave them another 4 years in 92 as well.
Well, certainly it gave the Conservatives that huge margin for error, and then there were a lot of errors, as I would admit, and as we got into the late 80s, it really gave that big margin. So it's not the case when he says things like, well, Labour are going to win anyway in this election. Well, there's a big difference between winning narrowly and winning, but with so many seats that nobody else can imagine winning the next one or two general elections except Labour. And that's not good for politics, probably wouldn't be good for the Labour Party either. But it certainly would not finish up with Nigel Farage and his team running the country. Definitely not. So it's a very self-defeating approach.
If only there was another way of doing politics, William, that might mean that the votes are cast and counted in a different way entirely.
Yes. Is the elephant in the room, this election, that the electoral system is totally broken? Reform could do much better than the Lib Dems and win only 1 or 2 seats versus the Lib Dems 30 or 40. Is that fair? Wouldn't Reform doing quite well give Farage a test in actually making law that he's never really faced? The two-party system is a central tenet of our democracy, but for how much longer? Kezia, we have had so many really fascinating but very convoluted and very complicated texts from listeners about how they basically go through about 3 different parties and then arrive at the party that they're going to vote for because of tactical voting, which I didn't realise was such a huge thing. Obviously, it depends, doesn't it, whether it's going to make a difference if you're in a marginal seat or not. And the point they're making, I suppose, is that they feel that their votes are, some people feel that their votes are pointless because of the system. Have you ever voted tactically? Do you know people who vote I can't even say it, tactically?
I think I've only ever had to do it once, which is where I briefly lived in an area that wasn't going to return a Labour councillor. In the northeast of Fife, for example. I can't remember, probably not, no, in truth, but then that's the whole point, right? I have tended to live in areas that are going to return Labour candidates or SNP candidates, whatever, regardless, and it's the Conservatives in those situations, or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens, that get exasperated because their votes don't count. I was amused earlier when you were talking about Douglas Ross. You know, if people think Douglas Ross was a decent kind of leader of the Conservative Party, it's because he only ever had to rally against the SNP, because there isn't a single Conservative Labour marginal seat in Scotland. So the whole country's having this competition right now between those 2 parties, and for the vast majority of Scotland, that's not the lay of the land. An electoral system that actually counted every single vote would allow people's voices to be heard, and it would also take a degree of control away from political parties. That's how you break the 2-party system, and you break that dominance of the leadership and the characters within that, determining where on a spectrum a party sits. We would have more political parties, we'd have more choice. Yes,
but what kind of choice? That's the point that a lot of our texters have been making. I mean, I suppose maybe you can't say, well, we want choice, but not that choice. If you look at within Europe at some of the parties that are winning seats, if you look at Reform, for example, getting 30 or 40 seats, would you be happy with that?
We obviously wouldn't be delighted if we started electing lots of far-right politicians in the country. But that said, that's how you defeat them, is with, you know, the harsh light of day. And part of the reason Reform and far-right parties do well is because they're allowed to cast themselves as, you know, anti-establishment pioneers. That we're really, it's because they don't face the same accountability and the same questioning that everyone else does. You would get that with PR.
William Hague, what do you think?
Well, I totally respect arguments for different electoral systems, and you can argue forever about them. I tend to support, I still support our current Westminster voting system, with the great example of so many European countries before us of how this can go badly wrong the other way. Germany is a good example at the moment. It's 7 parties in the parliament all the time. Quite a lot of them are extremists. That means the ones who are not extremists always have to be in government together. Then the extremists get more popular. And so there's quite a lot to be said for a system which, on the whole, corrals people into 2 big political families. And yes, it makes them fight out a lot of their differences within those families in the Conservative and Labour parties. But nevertheless, they end up, on the whole, in the vast majority of elections, those 2 parties try to win elections from the centre, bringing most of the political system with them. And so I think that is still the best system, but there's no perfect system. It does at least give people a choice of government. At least you know when you wake up the day after polling day, most of the time, who is going to be the government, and you don't have months of arguing about it.
Well, that's true, but you also wake up the next day and think, well, what was the point of me voting? That's what a lot of people are saying to us. They just, my vote doesn't count. I want to write none of the above. This idea of having these 2 huge political beasts, Labour and the Conservative, doesn't work for a lot of people anymore. And I also wonder, for example, William Hague, if, let's just say, I think the worst projection I saw was 122 seats for the Tories. Let's say that it's less than that. Do you think that the conservative mindset or Conservative MPs, supporters might actually change their mind and think, actually, you know what, let's have a look at this at proportional representation or a different system of electing people?
I don't think the two main parties will change either of them, whatever the results of the election, will change their approach on this. And by the way, again, there isn't a system where the individual voter wakes up and thinks, oh, it was me that they took notice of, among the 50 million people, because you might be a German voter who votes for their Liberal Party. And then you say, well, whatever I do, they just go into a coalition with the German Conservatives or the German Social Democrats. So what is the point? And you get exactly the a different problem of not feeling your vote has really counted in the German system. There isn't a system where all 50 million people are happy.
Referendums, everything on a referendum.
But
I was fully taken into account.
What?
And they listened to me and never mind the other
I'm sure
40 million.
that is the case. But just finally on Kezia's point that that actually you have a system where, for example, Reform win proportional to their votes, the same as the Lib Dems, for example. They win the same number of seats, and then they are scrutinised properly, rather than staying in the shadows and saying, no one listens to us, we're the underdogs.
That's been exactly the argument in France with National Front, now called National Rally, members of the National Assembly, and the result of them being put in that position is they are now on the brink of power. So that argument doesn't work either.